Thank you. And now I can say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our global audience around the world, distinguished speakers, guests, friends, and colleagues. My name is Maria Fornella Oninger, and I'm a representative for Soroptimist International here at the United Nations in New York. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion at the margins of the Summit of the Future. This event was organized by Soroptimist International, International Presentation Association, and the Sikh Human Rights Center, and co-sponsored by Bahá'í International Community and the NGO Committee on the Status of Women. Thank you, a big thank you to Bahá'í for their generosity and for hosting us. A big thank, and this is a remote thank at the same time, to Soroptimist International Headquarters staff in the UK, Hannah, Joe, and Margaret, and also a special thanks to our Director of Advocacy, Lee Elwood Brown. Today's discussion will explore the interconnected crises that shape our daily lives. Deep inequalities, climate change, an economic model that is not working for sustainable development of people or planet. As we gather here today, the Pact of the Future has been approved after 2 years of deliberations and some last-minute political theater. This document recommits governments to a set of 56 actions that set out and solve these problems. Therefore, we do stand at a critical juncture when these commitments from the SDGs and some from before are being reinvigorated. So resolving the crisis at hand while at the same time building a more equitable and sustainable future for generations to come implies rethinking economic development and reforming the financial architecture, and doing it through the lenses of social justice, gender equality, climate change, the well-being of all people, young and old, and the survival of our planet. No minor things, none of them. Now more than ever, we must ask ourselves, can we build a society and an economy that both serve everyone, preserve our planet, provide for our general well-being, and uplift those who have been left behind or have been pushed out? The answer must be yes, but it requires bold action by all of us humans, as well as reimagined strategies, cross-cutting strategies. The challenges are immense, but so are the opportunities. Today, as the President of the General Assembly said yesterday, we have the knowledge, we have the tools, digital and otherwise. We have the collective will to drive change, at least us in civil society and many others. So we must start the work right now. We must push, mobilize, advocate, and make sure that implementation happens this time. We must start today, and you can start with conversations around a table like this one. Today, we will hear from a diversity of voices from civil society to explore the intersection between or among these priorities and how we can add momentum to that implementation that we've been waiting for so long, for those states' renewed commitments. I'm sure that you, as well as me, are very excited to hear the young and not so young people around the table. So without further ado, I will now turn to my colleague, Despina Milaki, to introduce the panel and moderate their exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. My name is Despina Aphrodite Milaki. I am the UN representative for the International Presentation Association, and I will be your moderator today. We are really excited to have you all here this morning. So grateful for your time, especially these challenging days around the UN. And I hope you all enjoy this discussion. In the interest of time, I won't be fully introducing our speakers. You will be able to find their bios in the chat box for those of you who are interested. I'm sure there are many of you in learning more about our wonderful speakers today. So we will start our program a little backwards. There is a minor change. Our first speaker, unfortunately, he's caught up with the flight delays. So we will begin our discussion with our last speaker, a pleasant addition to our program, Mr. Eugene Stephen Okanda. He is the Kenya UN Youth Delegate. And he's also the executive director of Unlock Young Leaders Summit, a youth-based leadership organization in Kenya. As part of the African United Nations delegation, he's here in New York to amplify the voices of African youth and to advocate for meaningful engagement in all decision-making processes. So Eugene, a core element of the reforms that were adopted during the Summit of the Future is the need to put young people at the center of decision-making processes. The UN Secretary emphasized the need to be part of the decision-making processes, so did the Assistant Secretary General for Youth. What does youth engagement, meaningful engagement mean to you as a youth? And what are the key issues that need to be addressed in order to build a better future?
Thank you, Disponia. Honorable panelists and esteemed colleagues and fellow youth champions. I stand before you today, not just as a youth delegate, but as a voice for millions of young people across Africa and beyond. Now, our future, our planet, and our legacy depends on one key idea, what you call meaningful youth engagement. And this is a cornerstone for the reform in the Pact for the Future. And today I want to highlight some key practical solution that can be fully realized, especially when we talk about meaningful youth engagement. But meaningful youth engagement, just to start us off, is not just a seat on the table. It's about actively shaping the decision that will impact our generations and generations to come. Now, it means empowering young people to be co-creators in global policies. Now, what we are saying here is that young people are not the receivers of policy making. Young people are not the receivers of decision-making processes. Young people are the co-creators of policies. Now, I want to give you a case example. Despite comprising 75% of the African population, young people from Africa and what you call the global south and other parts of the world still face barriers for true participation. We are underrepresented in high-level international decision-making platforms. For instance, in the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly, only 3 African countries represented youth delegates, 3, from Tanzania, Congo, and Uganda. Now, this must change. Now, some of the issues that bring about what we call the barriers for meaningful youth engagement, we have inadequate inclusiveness in opportunities on global platforms. Number 2 is insufficient funding to support youth participation at global level. It took me a lot to come here as part of the Africa United Nations Youth Delegates. And number 3 is also substandard capacity building for youth delegates. But number 4 is tokenism, where youth are invited but not truly engaged in decision-making processes. But also, one of the issues that we are highlighting is a lack of universal youth rights, which we talk about leaving many young people vulnerable and unprotected. Now, a call to action for us to meaningfully engage young people, we need to strengthen. And one of the things we are pushing forward, especially as the Africa United Nations Youth Delegates Program, is the establishment of a youth consultative body. When you look at the reforms on the United Nations Security Council, we need to think of having a youth sounding board in the Security Council. If we truly mean well for the global peace that is becoming a global pandemic, we need to have the voices of the young people involved in the Security Council. But the other thing is that we need to allocate resources and resources for meaningful youth engagement. Now, we cannot talk about engagement without investing in it. A program like the African United Nations Youth Delegates Program only runs in 6 East African countries, and it's supported by the Germans. But now we need to have many partners coming on board to support the African United Nations Youth Delegates Program. This program needs to increase youth meaningful engagement at the UN processes. We left many young people who could not even get a visa to come to the United States. We left many young people who they had the accreditation to attend the Summit of the Future, but they did not have funding. So the question is, if we're going to talk about meaningful youth engagement, therefore, we need to have people who mean well to support young people in Africa so that young people can come and really, really engage in global policy. But the last thing is that we need to establish youth rights. Now we have the women's right, we have the children's right. One of the things we need to also look at is a legally binding UN Convention on Youth Rights. Now this will ensure that young people are protected and empowered to thrive no matter their background or location. Rights must include participation in political, economic, and social decisions affecting the future. Now, this is a bigger vision. This is a bigger vision that must be consolidated, and everyone needs to rally around this. Because if you're talking about declaration for the future generation, everyone needs to rally around and support young people to make sure that they have an enabling environment. Now, in conclusion, to build a better future, we need a stronger voice for youth in decision-making. Number two, we need an adequate resource to back up our participation. And number three, a recognition of our rights as young people. Now, together, let's make sure that young people are not just present, but powerful. Because when young voices lead, the future becomes brighter for all. I thank you.
Thank you, Eugene, for I'm sure all of us really appreciate them. I will re-emphasize your point regarding that we need youth not just sitting at the table, but a meaningful engagement, which means to actively shape the decisions, to be co-creators of policies.
Absolutely.
And what you said about the need for stronger voice, the need for youth rights to be there and somehow support in any way that we can, financially and further. And again, I am grateful for your valuable contribution to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I ask if Levi is on the call? Levi, are you there? No, so we have to move on to our second speaker of the day, which is Ms. Cecilia Schirmeister. She's a representative to the UN for the Bahá'í International Community. First of all, I echo Maria in thanking you for hosting us, for providing us the space, this room, to be able to have this discussion. We really appreciate that, and we're grateful for providing us this opportunity. So Cecilia, what do you think it would take to make this sustainable and better future become a reality?
Wonderful. So thank you so much to the organizers. It's such a pleasure to be with you all today. My name is Cecilia Schirmeister, as mentioned. I want to express support and amplify the voice of my colleague Eugene here, and also to support, of course, the co-panelists that will come after me. So I think, of course, we've all been immersed in the processes happening right now with Summit of the Future, with UN General Assembly Week, and I think we really see that the social conditions of the world and the betterment of the social conditions of the world and the economic conditions have to go hand in hand with sustainability and with the protection of the environment. I think we've heard a lot of descriptions about the challenges being faced in the world, whether it is the extremes of wealth and poverty, whether it is the presence of any form of prejudice, whether it is the influence of corporations that lack where there's no accountability mechanisms to check that. And those are all very real conditions of the world that we see today. But I want to challenge us to go a little bit further in our thinking and consider more the roots of these challenges rather than just the symptoms that we might be seeing on the surface. And I think a lot of that has to do with how we define progress. So of course, this is, like I heard it talked about yesterday, it's more a concept that is coming up in discussions, but overall it's been largely overlooked. And I think that question is really at the heart of social development. When we're talking about social development, it's how are we addressing the roots of it? And unless and until we redefine progress, our aspirations are just going to remain aspirations. We won't see them come to fruition. So I think one way to do that would be to think about progress more in an expansive way, maybe an expansive mindset towards progress rather than one of deficit. I think we also view progress solely in the material sense, and as important and crucial is the material and the economic conditions that allow for progress. I think there's a lot more to progress. There's the life of the community, there's family life, there's the social elements, and all of that, we can see expressions of that progress in many parts of the world that are in many ways way more advanced based on those definitions of progress than what we might necessarily consider to be solely the material and economic conditions of progress. So I think widening that definition of progress both enables us to, to approach progress and conversations about progress differently, but also sets us in a position of learning, because there is so much that all of us have to learn about how we can achieve what would allow for sustainable and equitable futures for all. So what does that take? Going back to the initial question, I think it takes leaning into a new narrative. And of course, that's not easy, but it's extremely important. And a lot of the transformation that we've seen in the world thus far with regard to economic progress, with regard to gender equality, all of that has relied on both transformation, a new narrative, but also a sense of optimism, of informed optimism that carries us to motion. And legislation, of course, cannot be the only means for achieving that. Legislation can reflect it, but it has to come, it has to come from the roots of our motivation. And I think there is receptivity for this. We've seen in the Pact for the Future, the calling for the independent high-level expert group to develop recommendations for indicators of sustainable development that go beyond GDP. We've seen the work that is necessary to reform the international financial architecture, as well as the international tax governance structures. And all of this ultimately, if we focus solely on the economic, it does risk that we remain in these limited conceptions of progress. And that's why I think when we think about progress, we really have to think about it from a holistic sense, so that these economic developments that are made fall within a wider structure that then supports the economic development to goals that support the well-being of all of humanity and not just the well-being of a segment of humanity. I think, the social forces that we see in the world today are often those that are based on competition, that are based on prejudice, that are based on the us versus them, survival of the fittest type of model. And we will probably continue to see that until we address those roots of the challenges. So lastly, if I have a moment left, I will just provide one example of this progress that we've seen in the Baha'i community around the world. So I wanted to just share an example of a Baha'i development organization based in India that is focused on the empowerment of women. So this organization provided a variety of services of training and capacity building towards the development of services that people could then use to benefit their economic well-being. So services related to agriculture, to literacy and numeracy education. And of course, those skills are undeniably helpful. But basically the way that the story goes is that after these women gained these skills, they returned to their community, started drawing on these skills, and they saw that competition, that again, this promoting of oneself above the needs of others, self-interest, all of that came into play. So the organizers of this development organization that was locally rooted went and changed the program and changed the service provision system to include basically the learning and the capacity building related to qualities like generosity, like solidarity, like mutual aid and assistance. And they found that through the enabling environment that allowed for both the economic, but also the social and the qualitative shift, then these economic indicators of growth meant a lot more for the well-being of the whole community, rather than just those few people that gain the skills.
That's right.
So I think that just that one small example goes to show that when we think about progress, it really has to go hand in hand, the quantitative and the qualitative. And these attributes that relate to how economic growth is built are vital to ensure that the advancement that comes benefits everybody and doesn't just benefit certain segments of the population. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing these points. You brought a different dimension on our discussion, emphasizing on the progress and the need to widen the definition of progress in order to be able to set us in a position of learning. And that holistic view of progress that you presented is really important for us in our everyday work. Thank you again for your insights. They were very inspiring. I'm sure all of us agree with what you mentioned. I think Levi is on the call. Levi is at this hotel. Anyway, we will move to our next speaker, and then when Levi is here, he will join us. So it is with great pleasure that I will introduce you to you, Ms. Ivy Koek, the representative to the UN for Soka Gakkai International, and the co-chair of the NGO Committee on the Status of Women, a very good colleague and friend of mine. So Ivy, I may sound repetitive, but we mentioned these days that we keep mentioning that this is a moment in history where we face a pivotal choice as a global community. Where do you think we need to focus on attention and action?
So thank you for having me and for having NGO CSW New York is happy to co-sponsor. I have to put Pamela Morgan on the spot too, because she's my co-chair. We're like one,
Yes.
two people, but one. I feel like so nervous in this room, and I don't know why, because usually, how many times have I done this? But I think what it is because we started with young voices. And I feel always like in the hot seat when I'm around young people. And I was like, I'm gonna sound ridiculous next to them because they've got it figured out. Really, I mean it with all my heart because I'm serious. My nerves are definitely not where normally I am. And so thank you again, Despina and Sir Optimus and the Sikh Human Rights. I thank you. It's very interesting to learn about you too. And so this question, Despina, I was thinking I had to start like personal first with this. And I was introduced as the representative of Soka Gakkai International. And then for me, it really where do we need to focus our efforts? I think it has to be building the culture of peace. I think I'm gonna be much more outspoken about this. It's in our hearts. It's always been the basis of our activities within SGI, but I think that it really permeates everything. And it's not just a soft topic. I think peace is often it's not about concessions. It's not, it's much more, it's so powerful, and yet we somehow devalue it. I mean, at the UN, it seems because we are so, focused on armaments. And anyway, so the culture of peace turned 25 on 13 September. Just wanted to mention that. And there is a quote, I think it's like a Chinese proverb, I'm not sure, but dig beneath your feet and there you will find a spring. And so so for me, it's like about that. It's this moment, it's this life, it's the person in front of me that's really gonna, that matters. I'm sorry to say, but isn't that really the realm of our power or our, influence? So if that's the case, we can talk about intergovernmental processes, but we really have to practice it, each one of us individually. So that was on a very personal level. I wanted to start there before I jump into committee stuff. So, the NGO Committee on the Status of Women, New York, I'd like to clarify there's a New York and there are also regional NGO, CSW. So our mandate is to convene, and I'm sharing just in case nobody knows what that is, because I don't want to assume. We convene civil society during the UN Commission on the Status of Women that takes place in March. And 10 years ago, we started a campaign called Cities for CEDAW. So CEDAW is the Convention on Eliminating Discrimination Against Women. So this is the only legally binding treaty. And Cities for CEDAW was a campaign launched in order to make sure, and the campaign has a life of its own. It's not that it is owned by the committee. But what's happened is in the US, we know US has not ratified CEDAW. However, they're trying to implement from the ground on the local level. So cities, municipalities are starting to pick this up, and it's growing, and I think that's the way to go. And the committee has at the UN, I think one very concrete, tangible outcome from the Pact is that it calls for CSW revitalization. And so I think that's something we'll definitely follow up on. Actually, we conducted a survey at the beginning of the year about this. We surveyed all the civil society. We have a listserv of about 40,000 and about 600 responses, we received from the survey about what they want from the commission. Because year after year, the same thing, it seems like the commission actually has just weakened over time, not strengthened. And I think lots of activists and, have their opinions on this and advocates working at the UN level. So we will definitely follow up, continue our advocacy work with member states. We have, even the executive committee of NGO CSW also will hold like a breakfast with ambassadors, and so basically continue to raise awareness and bring the voices of civil society there. And I guess, Beijing Plus 30 is in March. It's the 30th year after the Fourth World Conference and when the Beijing Platform for Action was adopted. And that was given as a time, the Pact clearly states that we need to start working then. So we hope to have something actionable and tangible from that. So that's what I'll share this time.
Thank you for your points, actually, thank you for the work that you do in the NGO and the NGO Committee on the Status of Women, the work you're doing there, and your continued commitment to improve the lives of women around the world and young girls as well. As you mentioned, it's very important to strengthen the CSW instead of just taking it as it is right now, which is a weekend phase of this committee. And it's really important, the project that you mentioned, the Cities for the CEDAW, that shows us the importance of local actors like municipalities and how they can contribute to gender equality. After all, everything is under this umbrella, gender equality. And I think it's the necessary foundation for a peaceful and more sustainable world, what we are discussing today. Thank you again. Is
Levy on?
Yeah, is Levy on? Ivan?
Not yet.
Not yet. So let's move to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Mr. Ananda Lee. Sorry, it's just the program is upside down today. Who represents the Just Transition Alliance as their strategic advisor. And we are extremely happy that you can join us today, Ananda. Ananda, what is your opinion? What do you think when we discuss about just transition processes to build a more sustainable world, a more sustainable, equitable future. What and who needs to be at the center of these policy initiatives?
Thank you for making it easy for me to directly jump into that. I appreciate all the previous speakers and our hosts. Thank you for having us here. And I was actually listening to the two of you. I'm actually reminded of the importance of this intergenerational dialogue. Because in the movements that I come from a lot of the social justice movements that came together in the 90s. And these are the movements of the poor in all of our countries. So whether we're in Kenya, South Africa, India, China, where my ancestry is from, or in these lands of Turtle Island, the Indigenous communities, the poor communities, the poorest workers in our communities, who fundamentally believe that change is inevitable, that's happening around us, but justice is not.
Yes.
And justice needs to be fought for. And that's our ancestors fought for to make it possible that in colonial empires, that the voices of those being colonized, of those being downtrodden, those being enslaved, and those whose lives, lands, and labor were stolen from them, have a voice at the table. That justice is something that we organize for, we bring democratic practice for. There's and I think we ourselves have in the last couple of decades engaged with the UN in three thematic areas: climate change, food. So we work closely with all the people who grow our food around the world, the poorest people on the planet who feed the majority of the people on the planet, and yet are suffering from issues of nutrition themselves. Workers like waste workers. We work with the Kenyan Waste Workers Association, for example, and who are youth-led. And these are women-led formations of labor around the world, places like India and Brazil and South Africa. These are women's unions that have been supported by many amongst civil society and have allowed these voices to come together. Indigenous peoples and other labor formations. And so Just Transition was really came about. Its genesis was at the intersection in North America, Turtle Island, we call it, because that's the designation of Indigenous communities. We still question the legal basis on which the foundation of the United States or even Canada or many settler colonial states are established on stolen lands, stolen lives. The voices of those who knew how to look after this earth long before we had a climate crisis are the most needed voices at the table. The people I say in my communities who have the longest standing knowledge of wherever they're given places, whose cultures have the longest living relationships with the earth, that allows us to act in reciprocity and respect, that really shares a sacred principle around the world of we call the divine feminine, that connects us to our common mother and all our relations whose voices need to be represented. So for us, the movements with the UN, the challenge is we do not see our movements as siloed to youth and women. And we say, well, we are an intergenerational group. But I'm reminded, listening to your two voices, that I'm reminded how your generation is teaching our older generation so much about how we need to change and flex and allow the radical imagination needed to solve some complex crises that we have created. Because where we stepped away and distanced ourselves from Earth's natural systems, sort of like the waste we create. Nature does not create anything such as waste. The people who remember this are the poorest amongst us, who live in the Kibera landfill, who lives in the Joburg landfill, who live in the Delhi slums and the slums in Rio. But the poorest workers who are cleaning our waterways by sifting through the waste of waste consumer society, sorting out the plastics from the metals, from the papers, while providing themselves a living and food on the table for their children. They're actually cleaning the air, the water, the land, so that our future generations are not poisoned. So remembering that, that's also future labor, but there's a discourse there amongst the people who need to be at the table that is intergenerational, that is oftentimes led by women, that is led by Indigenous peoples. So how do we sometimes break out of the silos of the UN designations to see this discourse has to be centered those first and most impacted historically, due to patriarchy, due to war, due to systems of caste and class and racial discrimination, that still continues today. And that we honor those who I believe have the best possible scenario. They have the most knowledge and skill to guide us through this complex ecological crisis, that is climate change, but it's also plastics pollution, is also our ability to feed future generations. And so we have a saying, that basically we speak for ourselves. That's one of our core principles, the democratic representation. And this is something that civil society has to really start integrating. How do we bring the voices as civil society, staff, organizations? How do we actually step back and serve those whose knowledge and vision of justice is keenest, and actually have those representatives at the table. And I'll end by saying we were here. We're in two sets of meeting. One where we're trying to bridge the communities, like Indigenous communities and labor unions, when we'd be talking to each other, because oftentimes we're pitted against each other in this false jobs versus environment narrative. And when we actually start looking at the root systemic causes, like we were talking about, that's when we realize we have much more in common in terms of our ability to change the economies that are driving this ecological crisis, but also do so in ways that are deeply democratic. And I think that's what we're talking about in terms of representation is we speak for ourselves, is really an articulation is we need to deepen democracy. So that because we know that many of the elected representatives are still from nation states that are the offspring of colonial extractive economies, of control, of greed, of displacement, of occupation, of war, people who aren't actually from there. I mean, most of Europe is still owned by a feudal class that never actually belonged there. I was just in Austria. And Austrian farmers were pointing out lords from Germany who took over their lands 800 years ago and are still worshipped, put on as a pedestal that are supposedly guides social democratic forces. And as long as you recognize that feudal nature of land and ownership all over the world, the colonial nature, we cannot really get to the deep democracy required at the UN to actually make critical systemic change. And so I would invite all of us to examine how do we as agents make room for those voices. The poorest of the poor, my mother used to say, people whose needs are most urgent amidst us, let's tend to those whose youth, those whose futures are at stake, including them, those elders who need to be, those grandparents who need to be talking to the youth, and having that intergenerational discourse, because it's so flat right now. The lack of richness and complexities that's required can only happen if we make this an intergenerational dialogue with our elders and youth and everyone who's not at the table. So I'll leave it there. I think there's so much to that question, but I think you all,
question, and I really appreciate that you gave us your input, very, very important, and for sharing your perspective. We heard Eugene talking about youth engagement, and now hearing you talking about Indigenous engagement and actually bringing Indigenous voices at the table. And as an organization whose one of our three focus areas are the Indigenous and tribal people's rights, we honor those rights. I always love to hear that Indigenous are the longest living. They have the longest living relationship with Mother Earth, and that's something that we need to keep as we move forward. Again, much appreciated, Ananda. I have been informed that Levi is on the call. I would like Levi, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yes, so our next speaker, he was supposed to be first, but unfortunately, the flight delay didn't allow him to join us. Dr. Liberato Bautista, the president of Conference of NGOs, also known as Congo. Again, unfortunately, to a last-minute change of his schedule, he cannot be here physically, but he will join us online. Levi, we're extremely happy to have you here, even through this virtual space. We gathered here today, 2 days after the Summit of the Future, as I said earlier, at a pivotal moment in a shared journey towards a more safe, more sustainable future for all. And I would like to ask you, what do you think are the key elements, the essential elements in transforming our system and creating a just and socially inclusive world, a more equitable world in which the needs of the most vulnerable are met?
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Maliki. Thank you, Despina. Good morning to you all. Good morning from Washington, D.C., where I am joining you. the delay in flight gave me an opportunity to jot down notes, and I usually speak of notes written on the run. I think the metaphor for this would have been notes written on the fly, but then the topic is too hard, so it's not really on the fly, because we're talking about a topic so important and crucial for us to talk about, and that is the building of global momentum for a sustainable and equitable future. An event that you are organizing just 3 mornings after the Summit of the Future. I use the time frame of morning to indicate that the summit has created an expectation almost like after a long night, there will be sunrise, there will be sunshine, and there will be sunlight, and that the morning will shed light on a state-driven intergovernmental process in which civil society actors had a very limited role to play. And I say the word very limited role to play carefully and studiedly, and that may deserve another occasion to discuss how meaningful or how restricted was civil society participation in the both the lead up as well as the actual Summit of the Future. As the president of the Conference of NGO Congo, I have always advocated for a meaningful collaboration between we the peoples and the member states and the UN system in multilateral undertakings, the Summit of the Future being one. This collaboration is meaningful if NGOs were given not just access to the physical premises of the UN, but also to the substantive premises, to the substantive agenda of the United Nations. Access to the UN's physical premises is one thing. It is another to have access to its substantive agenda, with a seat and voice at the table, so that the UN's repeated valuation of civil society as critical partners of a robust and transformative multilateralism is actualized. I say this with caution, but still offer the assessment that everything considered, a wide section of we the peoples have been at best bit players in this summit, and even those who thought they intersected at an artery, an important artery of the negotiations. And here I refer to the Civil Society Conference in Nairobi, whose outcome package did not land a mention in the 61-page Pact, no matter how high a billing by the UN, by governments of that civil society conference in Nairobi, unlike the Millennium Forum Declaration of Civil Society in 2000, in which mention was, in which the declaration of the Millennium General Assembly, the forum was, the declaration was mentioned. It's only been 72 hours since the gavel was banged to approve the trifecta of summit outcomes, the Pact for the Future, the Global Digital Compact, and the Declaration on Future Generations. It's perhaps too early to give it a studied and honest-to-goodness evaluation, but I think it's fair to say that we can give a few indications of where we think its failings are, as well as its successes. We do not have the time to explicate on all of this, but let me take a few, let me give you a few comments. Let me skip a few lines here. Okay. The Summit of the Future promised something very important, which is to forge an international consensus on how to deliver a better present and safeguard the future. That better future is beset with, quote, rising catastrophic and existential risks, unquote, but as well a promise that there is a moment of hope and opportunity to seek and pursue a future that is peaceful, just, and inclusive. These are phrases from the document. In this future, the Pact resolved to, quote, promote tolerance, embrace diversity, and combat all forms of discrimination, including racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and all their contemporary forms and manifestation. That's a tall order, but must be addressed and confronted if multilateralism as we know it, and as what the UN and the summit promised, a multilateralism that is to be reboot and retooled to address the present and challenges. So the trifecta of documents, the Pact, the Compact, and the Declaration, emerged from 9 months, 9 intense months intergovernmental negotiation, but whose final text the public only saw and read less than 72 hours deserves a closer look. Did the summit and its outcomes live up to what they were promised to do and produce? Antonio Guterres said, the Pact provides a path for a new global governance system that can prevent similar crises in the future. Guy Ryder, who shepherded the whole 9-month process, said that the Pact that will render the UN and the multilateral system more effective, participatory, and networked. Big promises that civil society must soon examine how they are actualized as the Pact for the Future is digested. David Miliband from the United Kingdom, and now the CEO of the International Rescue Committee, soon after the approval of the Pact, said the following: the test for the Pact, I should say, was not novelty but strength, commitment, and follow through in a world where the nature of global risk has changed, unquote. We will continue to test that strength as the days and months, as the present and the future unfolds, and as we digest the voluminous texts that the United Nations, were a manufacturer of words, present to us. How much hope can we master and invest in the follow-throughs that the documents identify? The news syndicate, The Guardian, said in its coverage soon after the Pact was approved, and I quote, "The Pact is a striking document in its admission of how multilateralism is currently failing." Now that's ominous. That's quite a dark statement. And that the speed of reform, especially those advocated in the Pact, does not match the speed with which the world is changing. Its existential threats, climate change, global migration, global violence, the widening technology divides, and superpower dynamics and the wars that they fight. The most significant premise of this trifecta of documents is its greatest peril, I might say, and how to turn another set of multilateral processes like the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs before into tangible actions that improve the lives of the world's 8 billion people and ensure the viability of the planet for succeeding, if not at least even the present generation. And so the summit has come and gone, and the future is upon us. That future is unraveling as intersecting social, economic, and ecological crises and political upheavals unfold before us. If I may be allowed to mix metaphors, we are in a future of present tense. The tensions before us are a set of polycrises we can only ignore to our peril. The fractures in the body politic, as well as in the economic, political, and political spheres and cultural spheres are palpable. Inequalities feed the interstices of these fractures. Will the Pact address this polycrisis and heal the fractures? Today, you would have heard me say in the past, there is an overwhelming surplus of fear and a glaring deficit of hope. We owe it to ourselves and future generations to ensure that the Pact, the Compact, and the Declaration become meaningful documents to reverse this intense fear and this dimming hope. Let me conclude by saying that empowering the voice and agency of people as they identify their concerns and craft their futures is crucial. This is why decreasing fear and replacing it with increased hope would augur well into assuring people of their dignity and human rights and the planet's sustainability. That realization of a multilateralism that is engaged in the imagination and actualization of a just, peaceable, inclusive, gender just, human rights oriented, and social justice bent future to attain a prosperous and sustainable future is a bold commitment that I bid us to engage in. And I think a self-determined and a people-oriented right to development, although scantily referred to in the documents, are a tall call, but a call that we must take. Thank you very much. I will share with you a longer text as I have prepared while delayed on the flight. Have a great morning.
Even if that meant to have half of them instead of the whole list of your remarks. I know that you're always very, very open and sharp when you speak, and that's what makes you unique. I really appreciate your valuable contribution today. And as I heard you speaking, I thought that this is a common denominator among the speakers today. You spoke about the restrictive participation of civil society, not only regarding access to the physical space, but also access to the substantive agenda of the UN. And that's something that should focus our work on. And that gives us hope, I guess, to connect it with your comment regarding hope and diminishing fear. In order to have that future that we all envision. Thank you again, Levi. I really appreciate your valuable contribution. Before we hear our last speaker, I would like to remind everyone that after that, we will open the floor to for discussion, for questions. So please start preparing them and have your questions ready to share them in the chat box for those joining us online. And for those here in the room, just have your questions ready. A kind request, please keep them short. And if possible, indicate the speaker that your question is being addressed to. Of course, if it's a general question, then all of the speakers will give the time to respond to that. So I'll move on to our last speaker, Mr. Ranbir Singh Mangat, an SDG campaigner for Sikh Human Rights Group. Thank you, Ranbir, for joining us today. We heard that the upcoming Pact for the Future demonstrates that global momentum on building societies that value more than just the economic output. Social progress needs to be measured not in a GDP-centric view, rather must be replaced by a new developmental model that places collective well-being, ecological sustainability, and as we heard, intergenerational solidarity as its main priorities. So in your opinion, what a post-growth economic model might look like? and how it can be implemented at the national or international level.
Absolutely, and I want to thank all of my co-panelists that have spoken today for their contributions. I appreciate them so much and hope that I'll be able to add a little bit to them. And I also want to extend my thanks to, sorry, I was told I need to raise my voice a little bit.
Yes.
So that's good, okay. So, I want to as well extend my thanks to Soar Optimist International, International Presentation Association, NGO Committee for the Status of Women, and Bahá'í International for helping to arrange this panel. So as our moderators and our speakers have iterated, we're here to discuss how we can build momentum to transform the development project from one that centers human well-being, equal rights, and the health of the planet. And to do that, we fundamentally need an economic model that shifts away from this aim of endless growth and which is embedded within normative frameworks at the national level, and which is supported by an international economic system that incorporates post-growth framing of the right to development. And as the world comes together today to reiterate its commitment to sustainable development, we have to consider what the legacy of growth-centered development has been for so many around the world, particularly within the neoliberal economic order. Today, growth is increasingly disconnected from human well-being. And for so many, this drive towards endless growth represents dispossession, stagnating wages, pollution, economic imperialism, and hunger. Growth at the cost of all else has resulted in an ecological crisis, climate crisis, and an inequality crisis. One needs to look no further than how most of our food, as my co-panelist has spoken to, one needs to look no further than how most of our food is produced in the 21st century. This is a system which is dominated by the profit motive of corporations and which has destroyed soils and our climate while so many still remain undernourished. This is a system in which national governments have allowed austerity to deprive people of economic support and social infrastructure while allowing multinational corporations to operate without responsibility. We need to build momentum around a new approach to development, one that is informed by our interdependence to the environment and to each other. It needs to be supported by national frameworks and an international economic system that recognizes a holistic understanding of human development. As we come together today, we recognize that these struggles are built from the ground up through solidarity, especially international solidarity. And in the past, we've actually seen ground level struggles translate into embedded frameworks at national levels in countries such as Bolivia and Ecuador, where indigenous conceptions of these concepts of buen vivir and aspirations of post-national development have been embedded at the national level. In Bhutan, the concept of gross national happiness is one that actually contests the concept of GDP as a sole indicator of what growth and development means. And each of these frameworks have embedded indigenous frameworks and embedded a sort of spirit of intergenerational solidarity to invoke a holistic conception of development that codifies environmental sustainability and human well-being. And at the larger scope, global communities still struggle for those types of national and international systems that support holistic human development. Ground level movements and international solidarity is how we as international communities can achieve environmental and global justice, without which we will not be able to achieve the aims set out by the Pact for the future, as well as the sustainable development goals that precede it. Earlier, I spoke a little bit to the systems of food production that connect each of us. And in an era in which austerity and trade liberalizations has been dispossessing small farmers, food sovereignty stands out as a freeing concept that brings us all together. And this is the right to produce food in an ecologically sustainable way, a culturally appropriate way, and not poisoning our lands and lowering the water table as has been done through corporate agriculture. If I may speak to a little bit about the work that SIG Human Rights Group has been doing before we move on to questions. SIG Human Rights Groups has been advocates for farmers in India as they successfully mobilized by the millions to challenge trade liberalization. We also support our affiliates at Nishani Sikhi as they challenge deforestation and ecological loss at the ground level. They help to mobilize small farmers and landholders through cultural and spiritual values to replace those forested areas that have been lost. And in my work, at Sikh Human Rights Group, I'm currently helping to organize a research study that aims to assess the contributions of Sikh communities around the world to the SDGs. And those of you who may know, anywhere in the world that Sikhs have formed and come together to create a community, they have established and sustained the institution of Langar, which is a term which translates to the Guru's communal kitchen. And this is essentially the free communal meal that any person who visits a Gurdwara may partake in, irrespective of their identity. And it is a system that minimizes waste and makes productive use of any waste that does arise. And we hope that this study will act as a template for measuring the impact that global communities will have upon the realization of the SDGs. We also hope that we can provide an example of how bottom-up globalization and solidarity can enact systemic change, starting from the grassroots and building into a system of intergenerational and international solidarity. So that was essentially what I wanted to speak to, but in closing, I do want to say that, again, I really appreciate the contributions of all of those who have come together today. I think that collectively we've been able to speak to a vision of what it means to be internationally in solidarity and what it means to empower international movements from the ground up. And that's a message and a spirit that I hope to see further push within all of our activities here during this week and into the future. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. We really appreciate your presence here this morning, and we are grateful for your words and for your remarks. Okay, at this point, I will open the floor for questions and give the audience the opportunity to share their thoughts. Shall we start from here? With Albert? Albert. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, all panelists, for your interesting interventions. I just have one reflection of what you were saying about thematic commissions, not necessarily only commission on the status of the women. I am in the executive now, a few months on the commission on the social development, and also we have other commissions, a bit maybe less known ones, population and development, CPD. We have also Forum on the Forests. Partly it has the same status. I'm not an expert of international organizations law, but the same status at the General Assembly and ECOSOC in the system. And yes, this is true. This is also I'm feeling that like instead of strengthening these commissions' roles and place in the whole UN system, we are actually sometimes even backtracking in certain ways. How we can really make sure that these commissions are driving force. We have done work in the CSOC regarding SDGs and Copenhagen Declaration. What is the status? I just want to know a bit more about with CSW, because my impression was I have not been really involved in the CSW processes. What is the status of CSW? You mentioned the Beijing process, like in CPD last year. I think it was Cairo Declaration, also we did Cairo +30. What is the situation now in CSW, and what are the main concerns? Maybe also others in this table will be interested to hear.
I mean, there are lots of gender experts in this room, actually. So I think it could be answered collectively too. Betty, I'm also looking to you with Women's Major Group. But I think, the Commission on the Status of Women, I think the definitely like civil society participation is a big one that we often, I think CSOC-D is a lot more than, and maybe it's the sheer numbers, I don't know, because I don't follow CSOC-D personally, so you can tell me if that's the case. But for example, like the NGO forum it takes place within the UN headquarters, but the CSW doesn't have a space for civil society within the UN premises. And even side events are quite limited. Member states are, vying to have a room. And so to have civil society be a part of it, so that's just part of the process. And I think the thing that everyone keeps saying is like implementation, like how can we hold everyone, accountable? What's the mechanism there for accountability? So, because it seems like, we adopt this, there's all these negotiations, we adopt this, we call the agreed conclusions list, let's say, which is adopted by consensus. And everyone goes home and it's like kind of put on a shelf and they forget about it. And so we need some process where actually we are monitoring, we are, reporting it, that accountability piece, I think, is what makes it seem the most ineffective, or, lots of great discussions take place there. Lots of great ideas, a lot of good language that's used in other processes, things that come out of like CSW. I'm sure all commissions can say that when you have a theme that you focus on, and like digital rights, and then, they negotiate something, and then that's then used in other UN processes. And so there's definitely there's potential there. And then there was discussion on, should we have the commission, should it move to like there was discussion with CSWB, any commission would be more effective within the General Assembly and not under an ECOSOC and all of that. But, the plus and minus of that. But I'm curious, Betty, if you have any other thoughts around CSWU. I know Women's Major Group does. You guys have a
It'll take
critical
us 3
eye.
days.
I know, on this, but if you
No,
had anything to.
Yeah, I do want to add something,
Yeah.
not in my Sir Optimus hat, but in my women's major group. I'm the global OP for the women's major group. And we have, and as a matter of fact, this afternoon, the major groups
Betty,
are
I'm
meeting.
sorry, do you mind if you can stand up just for the online attendees to be able to see you? If that's not
Sure.
too much uncomfortable.
Sorry, apologies. And I'm Betty Levy, and I'm the main representative for Sir Optimus International here in New York. And I'm also the global OP for the women's major group. And as a matter of fact, this afternoon, the major groups are meeting with the president of ECOSOC. And when we met with him just recently on a call, we spoke very much to the point, Ivy, that you were just making about, but from the other perspective, the lack of institutional memory of member states. So CSAC is the kickoff commission. And then a few weeks later is CSW. And for some reason, member states forget that during CSAC they said this, and they restart renegotiating all over. So one of the things that the major groups have asked the president of ECOSOC is to try to make sure that there are some continuing themes throughout the year, starting, right in the beginning of the year and going through HLPF, so that there is that continuity that you're talking about, so that we don't lose good language. So I think that's we are very lucky this year. The president of ECOSOC is Bob Ray, who's from Canada, and who's always been a great friend of civil society the 5 years he's been here. But what he has said to us loud and clear, this is his last year here in New York, and it's his last year in diplomatic services. So he's going out as president of ECOSOC, and he said he plans to use this year to be bold and as transformative as he can. So this is definitely, a good opportunity for all of us. And he is using the theme resiliency throughout his presidency, and the emerging theme, and I don't know the full title because they always end up having 40 words in a title, but the chair of CSAC did mention at our meeting last week that our meeting with the president of ECOSOC, that the emerging theme will be social resiliency. So there's a lot of space for us and for civil society to tap into that kind of information. And the president has 4 themes, and I'm going to totally forget them all, but I know it's climate, And it's human rights and gender equality. It's his big thing, and then he has two other ones that I don't have my notes, so sorry, I can't remember. But I don't want to take up any more room.
Thank you,
space.
Betty. Always to the point, and the continuity issue that you mentioned is really, really important. I think that we also need to hear from Jean Quinn. She is the former chair of the NGO CISOC-D, many years of experience, and I think that it's going to be really helpful to hear her perspective.
Thank you very much. I just want to follow up on what you just said, Ivy, and obviously concur with what Betty has just said. One of the learnings, I think, in this past year with CISOC-D was the meeting of member states before the Commission. And I think 6 of the member states said to us, why do you just leave it to come and meet us for CISOC-D, for this Commission? We see you this February. We look forward to seeing you next February. But what about meeting us in between? And one of the member states was the USA, major member state, and others. So I think it's up to us to be bold as well, and do that meeting going, keep the conversation, because that's where civil society, I think, will make a difference.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's really very, very important. And as part of the NGO CISOC-D Advocacy Subcommittee, I want to share that we found a way to manage our work towards member state mission visits. That's how we called it. And we sat down and decided that we should separate member states based on how friendly they are with us. How unfriendly. We didn't say any bad wording there use. If they are neutral, we just put them under the neutral category. And that was very useful for our work when we actually launched, when we went during those mission visits. Yes, Maria.
Yeah, I want to add something too, as far as opportunities for this year. Besides Beijing Plus 30, we have the Financing for Development Conference in June in Sevilla, Spain. And then, of course, in November, we have the World Social Summit. So this is a great year really to approach, to advocate. I hope that some of you will make it online or in presence, but FFD is where's the money, right? To do all these things that they promise. There's 56 actions. Okay, so financing for development and changing the way that decisions of financing are made is fundamental. We need to bring others to the table. We need to bring the South in, and all these things hopefully will be decided along this year. The World Social Summit is about the Copenhagen Declaration of 95. So 25 is the anniversary of what, 30? Yeah, 30 years. And it's going to be very much centered in people, because that's the center of the Copenhagen Convention. Development is about people, inclusiveness, and participation. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Maria.
Can I just add
Yes,
one
Betty.
thing?
Yes, please.
I just want to add one thing. Anybody who's New York based,
Can you
on-
stand up?
anybody who's New York based, because it's an in-person meeting, but on October 15th at the second committee, it's going to be a joint meeting of ECOSOC and the GA. And that's highly unusual. So if you're in New York, I really suggest people try to get to that meeting.
October 16th?
15.
15. The second, okay. Thank you, Betty, for the information. I see a comment on the chat about the GDP system and how it has failed to account for human welfare. If we can have a genuine progress indicator more inclusive and sustainable, that will be also important. Is there anything that you want to share on that topic, the genuine progress indicator? Just for those who are not familiar with the term, it's a methodology that measures the sustainable economic welfare by considering the costs and benefits of economic activity. Yes, Francis. Thank you.
Frances Zymaden. I represent the NGO
Sir Optimus, but also the NGO Committee on the Aging and the
Can you
stakeholder.
speak up? Because
Stakeholder
online you
group
need
on
to speak
aging
up.
as well. I want to say, being the oldest person in this room, that the future belongs to all of us, whether it's 5 weeks in the future, 5 months in the future, or 50 years into the future. It belongs to all of us. You know, those of us who've reached the twilight years, we also have a future. And I want to say that I'm doing this for my granddaughters. I do not want them to be fighting for the same things that I have been fighting for most of my life. I think many older persons can say, I'm sorry we have made this mess. But I remember my parents saying the same thing after World War II. Sorry, we got you into this mess. So generation after generation, we need to leave something behind us that is positive. And I want to say as a last thing, we must all be vigilant. That's my favorite word, because we cannot go backwards. We must be vigilant as we move forward. So I call on everybody to think about the future. The young will be the future old. Don't forget that. And so we're all part of this journey together. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you. Your contribution is always so valuable, given your experience, your wisdom. You have been advocating all of your years, for those topics, and we really appreciate your presence here today. I have a question from Cyril Ritchie, a good friend of mine. He's online, so Ivan, can you please unmute him?
Oh, thank you very much, Jasperna. After the high-level Congo intervention from its president, I hope you'll accept a low-level Congo intervention from me. The Pact and in the three documents are great, but they're certainly less than optimal. For a whole year and more, civil society was enthusiastic in its extensive preparations and inputs, and its hope for epoch-changing text. But we haven't got that. But we've got texts that we've got to work with, and we're able to work with, if they become meaningful. And above all, if the follow-up action restores not only hope, as Levi called for, but enthusiasm. We need to restore enthusiasm for the multilateral system. Someone quoted a journal saying multilateralism is failing. No, but it's certainly being undermined by some governments. That's the defect in the United Nations system. The governments are not fulfilling the commitments that they have undertaken when they signed the UN Charter. And I don't hear speak of members of the permanent members of the Security Council violating Articles 1 and 2 of the Charter. But in general, there is a lack of enthusiastic support for the wonderful principles of the Charter and for implementing what is decided. I often have in my vision the 2005 summit of heads of state and government, who headed their document, their agreed document, "We shall spare no effort." And yet today, heads of state and government are still recalling all the things they have agreed to and haven't yet implemented. And that's where the role of civil society is so crucial. It's only when we actively and publicly hold governments to account, not for anything theoretical, hold them to account for implementing the decisions they've already made in the interests of their own people. And that's the challenge for civil society for this year, next year, and for all future generations too. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyril. Thank you. Always, yes, Maria. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Cyril. We really appreciate your remarks. And I will give the floor to Levi now before we close our meeting. Levi? Are you there?
Who were you calling?
Levi, you asked for the floor, no?
Oh, yeah. I was going to say that one of the hopeful notes in the 56 action recommendations of the Pact is Action 53, which says we will develop a framework on measures of progress on sustainable development, complement and go beyond gross domestic product. I don't know, for those of you who've been following the whole debate about GDP, and there was a comment on the chat, GDP as an inadequate measurement of the economy. And I think this is a major win in this in the Pact. And I think I look forward, for example, to a CSW initiated event, NGO CSW, I should say, initiated event where we will now start to account for the cost of parenting and how parenting, which is unpaid labor, actually contributes largely to gross national income, not just to gross domestic product as we know it. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Levi. I think moving ahead in the months to come, how to unpack those actions in the Pact for the Future will be our main focus as a civil society. Before we close our meeting, and now that we have heard all these diverse voices, what the panelists said and what the audience asked, I will kindly ask our panelists to share just one final thought, like what comes in your mind, what is in your heart. Maybe you want to share how do you envision your work or our work in 12 months from now, or how what your advocacy will be in the future. Just a few words, and don't worry, after that I will let you go. I'll start backwards this time, Eugene.
All right.
Let's go first. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. For me, this is a momentous occasion. This is my first time in New York, and the very first time attending the General Assembly. I used to read this in books, but it's a sad state because almost 90% of young people in Africa do not understand the work of the UN. They don't understand the Pact of the Future. So it's my responsibility to go back and unpack the actions into the palatable language, because the language of the Pact cannot be understood by the average young person in the village, in the slums of Kibra. So it's upon me, especially now that I run an NGO back in my country. It's 4 years old. It's upon me as a leader who has gotten an opportunity to come to this summit, to conceptualize everything that I've had, and to go back and making sure that the young person in a rural village understand the commitments of the member states. And this is going to be a very, this is going to be a very long shot, because quite a number of issues about financing, like for a young organization like myself, lack of finance makes such of this responsibility to be so hard to be achieved. And it's upon me now to just look at how am I going to finance those activities. We have 47 counties in my country. We have a population of more than 50 million. 75% of the 50 million are below the age of 35. We are heading over to the general election in less than 2 years' time. And we do not understand quite a bit of what the government, action plans for the government, and therefore it's a huge responsibility. And therefore I drop the ball back to all of us. All of us here, we have a responsibility. We have been given a portion of the darkness in the world to make sure that we are illuminating the light. So it's upon us to go back and making sure that every young person in your country, every young person in your community understand how to engage, so that they move from participation to meaningful engagement. And I thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Cecilia.
Sure. So
Thank you.
this was an amazing panel, an amazing discussion. I'm so honored to have been a part of it. And I think just for my closing remark, I'll just say that I feel like all of the panelists highlighted so beautifully the posture that I think we as people, we as UN, civil society missions, everyone in the UN community, I guess. This beautiful posture that we would all really benefit from exhibiting, which is one that I think it was your words, like serves and also steps back to allow the voices of those that are most primarily affected, those also that through intergenerational, through the generations or through one's culture, have the most expertise to respond to some of the challenges that are just not moving forward in the decision-making rooms across the street. So I think also, as you shared, like very much this sphere of influence, it is often in our day-to-day life, it is a person in front of us, but we also have this responsibility to expand as much as possible and to share the knowledge that we are privileged to receive because we're in these spaces. So that's all I'll say. Thank you so much.
Boy, there's so much. Actually, I'll bring up something my Sikh brother brought up, and the issue of neoliberalism, because I think that a lot of the tensions, whether it's the metrics of progress, is how we redefine, a better world, Boim Vivir, how do we institute principled practice, and pathways of justice that really guide a lot of, our ambition. I would say there's a core tension between neoliberalism, the force of the marketplace, and basically the people who are making money, profiteering off the destruction of this planet and all its peoples, against the essential needs of those, amidst us, those on the front lines of the crisis, the poly crisis, as was mentioned. And I think if we focus in on that, I think there's importance to align ourselves using principled practice on the side of human need versus corporate greed. And really, that's the crux of a lot of what we're about. The overwhelming influence of corporations and the neoliberal forces, the UN, needs to be ended. How do we align ourselves? And this booklet is just one of many tools on climate change, where we need to take a stance on which side we are on, the side of human need or the side of corporate greed.
Thank you,
Very good.
Ananda. Thank you so much. I know that we are over our time, but I would like to ask Levi to share with us a few words before we close the meeting. Levi?
Say that again, Despina?
Share a few words, what it is in your mind, what is in your heart after you have heard so many diverse voices and comments and inputs.
Well, there are, let me say in very few words, because our time is limited. My challenge for us, if I may redirect partly the conversation, are on three things: civic values, the cultivation of civic values, the engendering of civic engagement, and the taking of civic action. I say this because we are expressing our hopes and aspirations and taking on the charge to actualize the promise of the Pact, no matter how deficient they are, in a shrinking public space and in a shrinking space where the voice and agency of we the peoples expressed in either NGO formation, civil society formation, or critical social movements. And they were also at the UN in these last days to voice not just their critique of the pillage and plunder of historic legacies of slavery, colonialism, racism, and sexism, but also the current expressions of these that are expressed in the current social divides, digital divides, and the many other divides. So I encourage us to engage ourselves in the cultivation of civic values that underscore global citizenship ever more so in a revitalized, transformative multilateralism. But secondly, the engendering of civic engagement, where citizenry is supposed to go beyond allegiances simply to the nation state, but this time allegiances to people and the planet, a planetary cosmology, if I may borrow from our indigenous siblings, a cosmology that goes beyond national sovereignty, but a cosmology that embraces the entirety of the humanity and of the planet. And that's a hard thing to do, but a hard thing we must confront and address. And lastly, take civic action seriously, planning to take actions toward social justice from grassroots, local, national, regional, and international levels that redound to the improvement of not just the relations of peoples and nations, but also providing the possibility of reconstituting our communities that have been plundered and pillaged, but also because of the predatory and extractive character of the economic paradigms that we live in, so that then by doing so, we can reconstitute ourselves and ready for the future that we invariably around the table describe and hope for. Thank you very much.
I just didn't want to put you last because you spoke last, so.
I appreciate the consideration. So, I think that as we all come together here, we're at a moment of great historical consequence and of great importance. And I think as one speaker had mentioned that we are in a in a present in which we must be considering the future, forgetting the exact wording, but and I think that as we come together, we must think about, and as we speak with one another and congregate and organize ourselves, we need to think beyond the agreements and the institutions that we create, and think about how we can work on enacting the ideas that we articulate through them at a global level in order to ensure that everybody has human rights and the ability to embark on self-determination. So I think that's what I'll leave.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much. Ivy? Last but not least.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, you know, even New Yorkers, how many of them know about the UN?
Yeah.
I mean, the US is full of people who not only don't know, they don't
They
care.
don't like it. Or
They don't care about
they don't
the
know
UN,
it, they
and
don't
then,
like it.
you know, and then they're, yeah. So, I mean, there's so much room for action. And I guess that's what I'm coming out with, action. And because the UN is our space of advocacy, those of us who are here doing advocacy work, then, you know, I love there was an event that, of course, the Baha'i was part of about optimism, bringing in optimism and hope. And, you know, there's a quote from Tagore that I had mentioned at another event, but it's, you know, about that faith is the light that, faith is the bird that feels the light before the dawn. So, I mean, it's very dark, and I think member states need encouragement from us, just as we need to encourage each other in the work that we do, because we know that the challenges are big and they're just going to keep getting bigger. But we also have lots of big solutions that are actually happening, you know, on the ground. So that's all I want to share.
Thank you, Ivy. It appears that we all are on the same page. We talk about a new phase, a new journey, which has begun from the UN Summit of the Future. The Pact for the Future provides the path forward. As the Secretary General emphatically has stressed, it opens doors, but it is our responsibility to walk through them. It is our responsibility to take the commitments and turn them into actual results. It is not what we are going to do, rather how we are going to do it. I think that we all agree that the pact belongs to the people, and we can demand from our governments, but it comes down to what we do as a civil society. As I said, it is our own responsibility to put these actions into practice. it's all about actions and choices, right? Eugene just asked me for a minute of our time just to share with us some news.
Yeah.
And please go ahead, Eugene, before we close our call.
Thank you for your kindness. So I just wanted to mention, as the Africa United Nation Youth Delegates and Representatives Program, to respond to the issue of helping young people in the African, and especially in the East African continent, to understand what the work of the UN does. The 12 young people you see on this booklet, they're working with young people in the 6 countries to help them understand the work of the UN through what we call the outreach campaigns. So they have been able to, up to this time, we have been able to reach to more than 2,000 young people in the East Africa, in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. And just helping young people within the specific rural areas to understand the work of the UN through the outreach campaign. So if you want to learn more about the African United Nations Youth Delegates Program, just go online, search the African United Nations Youth Delegates Program, and you'll be able to learn more. I came with this copy, so I'm going to leave it with Disponia, and then possibly she's going to pass it around, and we can also share the online version of this the position paper. This was our position paper, our response towards the Pact of the Future. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that we are over our time. We have a comment in the chat. It's something very, very important to be raised, how to promote sustainable pathways and what's the role of the government in that sense.
Darlene Anderson.
Darlene, that was the comment. There is another question, if there is a bank for civil society support. No, a direct bank, no, but you can reach out to individual civil society organizations and you can provide your assistance there. I see people smiling around the room. I want to thank everybody for participating in this conversation. Our own Dan is here. He's from the Bahá'í International Community. He's a very, very warm supporter of our work together with Cecilia. You're not here to let us out, right? You just
Initially, I was here to keep you in.
Okay, thank you again for hosting us. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it has been a pleasure, a real pleasure to have you all with us today. Extremely grateful for your comments, for your inputs, and the insights that you shared with us. A big thanks to those of you who attended us online. Thank you for your time, for your participation. And again, thank you for our co-sponsors, Bahá'í International Community and NGO Committee on the Status of Women New York office. Thank you for your time. Thank you to our wonderful speakers for making the time to be here in these extremely challenging conditions around New York. Thank you again for everything, and I hope to see you soon.